We've now built the majority of components that we're going to need for our project. Now's the fun bit where we put everything together as part of our process. You may notice that in the project folder, we have a main.xaml file, which contains the state machine, which we'll come to shortly. We also have the process.xaml. Now we've been using the process file to test some of our invoking of workflows, but let's now use it to put all of the pieces together. First of all, let's uncomment out the Acme login activity. Here's where we get the password and then invoke the Acme login component. Next up, let's navigate to the work items. On the left-hand side in the Acme folder, we have a navigate to work items workflow. Let's place this after the Acme login. Click input arguments to check if there are any required arguments. We can see that the navigate to work items workflow is expecting an in working ID. For the time being, we're going to leave this as the default value. However, in due course, we'll start to pass through multiple different work IDs in order to process all of the working IDs that we need to work through. So we log in, we navigate. At this point, we don't actually need to extract all of the work items. We'll do that at an earlier point, but we'll come to that later. So we'll leave this section commented out. Once we've navigated to the next work item, we need to extract all of the work item details. So we can continue to extract the customer ID, customer name and customer country exactly as it is in our process so far. Once we've extracted the details, we want to go to the SHA1 website. Let's take the SHA1 generate hash component and invoke it. Click import arguments and let's check the values. The URL is going to remain the same. We need to create a variable to store our generated hash code. Let's call this str generated hash code. And our in customer info is going to be a concatenation of the information that's been extracted previously. So quickly let's check what those values are. str client ID, str client name, and str client country. We can actually steal this from the message box. Let's copy the information and remove all of the text. Replace the text with a single dash. So that we have client ID dash client name dash client country. Perfect. Finally, let's take the update work item component, invoke it and pass in the required information. File path isn't actually required, but it's not a problem to leave it there. The generated hash code in is going to be our newly created variable, str generated hash code. Our work item status, let's leave this as a hard-coded value of completed for the time being. So, now we've got all of this, let's give it a whirl, see if it all works. First of all, we need to make sure that all of the applications we're working with are closed down. Before we run the process, we just need to make sure that the SHA1 website isn't open, which it isn't, and make sure that the Acme Academy application is on the login screen. In due course, we'll build a component to launch the Acme application, but for now, we can start from here. Okay, let's run the process, see what happens. So when we run this process, we're getting an error saying that the Acme System 1 work item selector couldn't be found. The reason for this error is that we didn't successfully navigate to the work item details page. Let's add an additional check in the Acme login component to make sure that we're on the right page before we start looking for the work item details. Let's check that we're on the page that contains the text dashboard. Double check the selector. Looks good. Let's put an if statement in to make sure that the screen was found successfully. In the exist property, let's Control K to create a new variable called bool screen found. Press enter. If bool screen found equals false, then let's throw an exception. The reason this makes a difference is because there's a timeout on the element exists activity. What we can do is increase this to 10 seconds to give the dashboard a little bit more time to load before we check to see whether we should move on to the next component. If it fails, we'll throw an exception and say that the screen wasn't found successfully. Alternatively, quick log message. Screen found OK. Let's save. Let's try running again. Make sure we're logged out of the application and run the process. Okay, this time it's worked. However, the problem we have is that the work ID that we've looked for is 574271, which is actually a type WI1. We need to change this code to make sure we're looking for type WI5 rather than WI1. Let's find an example, make sure that it works once the robot finishes. And let's also remove that message box because we don't need that. In our list of work items, let's find a WI5 example. At this point, if you've got some completed items, let's also go back and reset them. Click Home, User Options, Reset Test Data. Okay, back to the work items. Let's select WI5 and open case, 762505. In your process, where we navigate to the work item, update the value of the inWID argument with 762505. Make sure that we're logged back out of the Acme application. And let's run the process. And hopefully this time it will work successfully. Fantastic! We now have a successfully running process.